Hello and welcome to OurTime. Our guest this week is Stan Nowakowski. He's signing in Auslan, the Australian language for the deaf. Stan is of course not deaf, but he's been signing since his wife was diagnosed with a degenerative hearing disease. His whole family has learnt to sign so he could communicate with his wife and the family with their mother. Welcome, Stan. Now you can relax.
Thanks, Malcolm.
We got so used to seeing people signing during the COVID speeches by every politician around Australia. Were you part of that too? Did you?
No, that was people who are far more skilled and experienced than I was. I
don't know, you're pretty experienced when we go through your background.
But not in signing. I'm a new boy. I've only been doing this for about 5 years in terms of interpreting.
Right. But you learnt to sign
a long time ago. I did.
So let's just quickly whip through your life story as to how you ended up signing. So were you born in... Where were you born?
So I was born in Australia, as in...
born in Australia, but with Polish parents?
Polish parents. So mum and dad emigrated after the war.
Right.
And had 4 kids, of which I am the eldest. I have 3 younger sisters. And
a wife, of course.
And I had a wife, yes. But she passed away 9 years ago as a result of this genetic disorder that we talked about earlier.
So just explain, so when you met her, she didn't have this disorder?
No, she wasn't aware of it. We were married for 10 years before she started having some unusual symptoms and finished off going to the doctor and having some tests. And
her name was?
My wife's name was Eve.
Eve, okay.
Yep. She was also...
talking about your wife, let's talk about Eve.
Yep, so she was also of Polish background, which is how we met in the Polish community in Melbourne. And so we married, and by that stage I was already in the army. And so we met shortly after I joined, and we were married for nearly 35 years, of which the last 25 years was basically spent looking after her as her condition deteriorated.
So this is a very rare condition, isn't it?
It is pretty rare. It's not totally uncommon, but it's not very well known. It's called neurofibromatosis type 2, or NF2.
Right.
It's a bit of a mouthful. But predominantly it affects the brain stem, creates a number of benign brain tumours, and they just affect a whole series of different very important nerves, of which mainly the balance and the hearing nerves are affected.
When this began and she was not able to hear as well as she was before,
yep.
How did you start to learn to sign? Was that something you had a telepathy with your wife initially because you knew each other so well you could point to things, or?
No, look, I mean, her hearing was still good enough at that stage that we were still able to, chat. I mean, there was nothing wrong with her voice. She was still able to keep talking. It's when we arrived here in Adelaide. This was my last army posting here in Adelaide. So in the mid-90s we arrived here, and we decided at that point her hearing was on its way down, but she was still hearing, that we would actually decide to take some positive action and find a strategy to allow us to communicate once she became deaf in the next few years, which is what we expected.
And you knew that was ahead?
Correct.
Sadly.
Yeah.
And sadly it's been passed on to your son as well?
Yeah, my youngest son, he unfortunately has inherited that. It is a hereditary disease, although in Eve's case it was a spontaneous mutation, so nobody else in her family has it.
Right.
But unfortunately Stefan, my youngest son, does have it, so he's now 35, and we've known that he's had that for the last 20 years now. So he's now also fully deaf.
What a difficult thing to come to terms with, or was it slow that you sort of came to terms with it slowly?
With Eve, or with
Eve? Yes.
Yeah, look, it was. It did take its time, and of course we didn't know how it was going to progress or manifest itself throughout her life. And we've since met other people with the same disorder, and they have some slight differences in the way that particular disease shows itself. So there are some common denominators.
This is going to happen.
Yeah, that's right. The only thing we know is that they will go deaf.
Yep.
But there are other issues that some people have their spine affected, so they become paraplegic. Others have their vision affected. Again, because it's these tumours form in the spinal cord and other nerves in the brain.
We're such fragile beings at the end of the day, aren't we?
We are, but we can also be very resilient and very tough.
Well, you were resilient because you both learnt to sign.
Yeah, well, that was interesting.
Well, the whole family learnt to sign.
Yeah, like, I mean, for the kids it's easy because learning a language for kids is much simpler than it is for adults. And so to learn a third language in my case, as an adult, in my 40s at that stage, I found something challenging.
Well, just to explain what you just said, so your first language would have been Polish from
Correct.
your parents, then English, then Auslan.
Yes.
And the thing that I've only come to terms to understand recently is signing all over the world is like the different languages all over the world. Nobody signs the same.
No, we have, Australia shares common language with Britain and with New Zealand. That's about the only three countries that share a very similar language.
But they're not exactly the same.
They're not exactly the same,
but you can sort of work it out.
The common denominator is the way we fingerspell. So we fingerspell letters or words. So if you, for example, if I spell my name, it's in Australian Sign Language, it's S-T-A-N. Other languages are based on essentially the American Sign Language, which is all done with one hand. And so American Sign Language to spell my name would be S-T-A-N. So it's all one-handed.
So if you're doing that, would have to be really fast.
People who do this professionally are very, very quick. In both languages.
Right.
The good thing about the one-handed fingerspelling is you can eat and talk at the same time. So.
Oh, I love it. There's always humour in these things.
There's got to be.
There's
got to be.
When your wife was obviously getting worse, was that harder for her to communicate back?
It wasn't harder for her to communicate to us because she just spoke. So her voice wasn't affected.
She could speak.
It was all about her being able to hear what was being said around her. So we would sign to her. So after we...
Would you speak at the same time that you signed?
We did, but that's not a good thing to do because Auslan grammar is actually quite different to spoken English grammar.
Oh, yes.
So the word sequence is quite different. But that just meant we weren't signing properly, but we were still signing, and it was enough for her to be able to understand in the main what was going on.
With a group conversation?
Yeah, that's a bit challenging, especially if there's a lot of speaking going on at the same time. Difficult to keep track of what was happening.
You just have to be everywhere.
Yeah, you do. In a deaf gathering, it's quite interesting trying to keep track of conversations because there's lots of hands flailing everywhere.
Yes.
And you've just got to pick your audience.
Put your hand up to say, I'd like to say something, please.
No, actually, it's a little bit more subtle than that. It's banging the table generally or something similar.
Yes.
Because that gets people's attention because people normally have their hands resting on tables and they'll feel the vibration. So.
Right. How's it affected your life?
Look, the last few years of Eve's life was particularly challenging as her condition continued to deteriorate. It was pretty tough. So both mentally and physically, I think I was starting to struggle. And so when she eventually died in 2015, I was, I think, pretty fragile. I really needed to get out and just find some space of my own, which I managed to do. I moved out of Adelaide and headed out towards Murray Bridge. And there were two reasons for that. One is I just needed some quiet space and place to sort of recharge the batteries. The other one was that in the last few months of her life, I'd actually gone off and found some me time and started learning to fly, and that was out at Murray Bridge.
Yes, and we're going to talk about that in a minute because I know about what you do with that. With signing, did it start simply? Is it sort of like when you learn to type, for example, you just type with two fingers and then you add the other, you become four-fingered and so on?
Yeah, look, that's not a bad analogy actually. We start off with a basic introductory course in sign language, and it teaches you some of the simple or finger spelling, so learning how to fingerspell A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc., all the way through to the end of the alphabet. And that allows you. How long
did that take you, by the way?
The course is about 5 or 6 weeks.
Oh, right. But you'd have to practice.
Yeah, you need to practice. It's like with any language, whether it's spoken or signed, you need to practice it to be able to remember what was said the previous lesson and what have you. And they teach you some simple things like, hi, how are you? My name is Stan, And in some cases, some of us were given...
Just do Stan again?
So S-T-A-N.
Oh, right. So you are just spelling out the actual letters, yeah. What's mine?
Yours will be M-A-L-C-O-L-M. So the challenge is, you've got to have a pretty good understanding of English so you can spell it correctly, because if you don't spell it correctly, you can lose the plot if you're trying to communicate with someone who reads your finger spelling.
You don't want to use a word like anti-establishmentarianism in your...
If you needed to use that particular word and you'd try to avoid it like the plague, you would have to finger spell the whole thing out.
Right.
And
is it as you're doing that? Obviously, you just did that with what we did at the introduction, but as people were doing that with all those COVID instructions and updates. How far behind what's being said are you? Because it's a lot to take in, or are there shortcuts with phrases or words?
Yes and yes. So the first part is...
Okay, I'll ask you another question.
So there is in fact a lag, and that's because we have to listen to like a whole sentence and then change the grammar and then convert that into Auslan.
Right.
Because the grammar is different from spoken English. The second one is that we don't finger spell every single word, because although that used to be the case in the past, nowadays their Auslan incorporates signs which summarise words or even phrases.
Then it's very much like a lot of the picture language, I suppose, where a picture literally said 1,000 words.
Well, that's why it's so good, because it is very visual, and so some of the signs depict the object you're trying to talk about. Whereas others are quite abstract, so you wouldn't be able to associate the sign with the word that you're trying to interpret.
Well, Stan, we'll be back and we'll talk to Stan about the other passion in his life, which is, of all things, flying. We'll be back in a tick. Stan is our special guest in this episode, and we've just been talking about the things he's been doing signing, but there's a couple of other questions before we talk about your flying, which is so opposite in many ways, but I can understand a great escape. You had some very interesting shows during the Fringe, I believe, that you were signing for.
I have, yes. So most of us interpreters in Adelaide, at this time with the Fringe, get invited to interpret some of the shows to allow accessibility for the deaf community. And so yes, I've had a couple of very interesting jobs. I think probably the most colourful one I've had so far was probably a drag burlesque show with a Shrek theme, which was very, very different, but very entertaining and amusing, I have to say. So
how do you sign Shrek? Do you have to spell out the name?
Well, you weren't allowed to sign Shrek because it's proprietary, you see.
Oh.
So that character...
Well, that's an interesting thing, though, in signing, is it? Or why would it be? Because it's an English word.
Well, it's an English word, but they didn't actually use the term Shrek throughout the play or the performance. He was referred to as the ogre. The ogre. Yes.
Do you wear clothes?
Initially.
Okay. Only burlesque could do that.
Oh, yeah.
We initially met, though, at the Ageing and...
Disability
and Ageing Expo.
Correct.
And you were standing beside me as I was chatting away, and I'd never experienced that before, so I didn't know whether I was talking too fast or too slow.
No, in a situation like that, we just sort of go with the flow, and if it gets too fast and we're sort of getting overwhelmed, we will just start summarising what's being said rather than trying to make sure that we speed up our finger spelling or signing that much faster. It does overload.
Do people show gratitude afterwards, like thank you, because that's made everything make sense to me?
Yeah, look, absolutely. So if there is a deaf audience, and unfortunately I don't think we actually had any deaf people at that particular expo, but at the Fringe shows that I've interpreted, there was one lady who came up to us afterwards, because I was interpreting with another interpreter, and she came up to us and she said, "Oh, that was fantastic. She's actually a student of Auslan, just starting to learn." So she was able to sit there and said, "I know that sign. Oh, I know that sign. I recognise that sign."
Right.
So she could appreciate some of it at least. The more recent one that I did on Monday night, again, a lady who didn't know any signing, but just said she just loves watching interpreters because it's such a very visual way of depicting what's being said.
Well, some comedians have used it to their best advantage.
Absolutely.
Now, let's talk about the flying, because this must have been, in more ways than one, the greatest escape.
Look, for me, absolutely. I have always had a desire to fly, as you know, from childhood days. You know, Dad took me an air show, took me to an air show at Laverton in Victoria when I was a young lad, and I was just almost literally and figuratively blown away by what I saw, and just something that I always wanted to do. I joined the Defence Force hoping to be able to fly, but my vision wasn't good enough at the time. But I was very fortunate that my best friend that I met through the Army became an Army pilot and later Air Force pilot, and I was able to fly with him on a number of occasions. After we both retired from the services, he rang me up one day, like 20 years after we retired or thereabouts, and said, "Have you ever heard of RAOs?" I said, "No." And so I looked it up online and found out this organisation called Recreational Aviation Australia, and 2 weeks later I was taking my first lesson. And that was 9 years ago. I've now amassed about 850 hours, and I've been an instructor now for the last couple of years as well.
Has that been, it's an odd question I suppose, but has that been like a flow on from signing, that you're used to teaching in a funny sort of way?
No, not really, because I don't teach per se in Auslan, but I have done...
No, but the fact that you're communicating...
Oh, most definitely.
Yeah, and putting those words into somebody's head.
Yeah.
I guess you're doing the same when you're teaching flying.
Look, very much so. I have always enjoyed instructing people, you know, and teaching them. So I've been a kayaking instructor. I have, you know, worked all sorts of different volunteer roles in the past.
Yes.
Which invariably involved passing on knowledge to someone else. And, you know, I lectured at UniSA of all places for about 6 years out at Mawson Lakes as teaching postgraduate students in engineering. So I do enjoy, you know, teaching.
It's the involvement with others.
Oh, very much so. I think I'm a social animal. It's safe to say.
We all are, with any luck,
yeah.
Because there's not much else to live for, really, apart from each other.
I agree.
When you think about it. What's the sensation for you when you're up there?
Look, it's my happy place. It's where I...
But your head isn't going, oh, I need to check that, I need to check this, oh, the instruments are doing that.
You do need to do that, but that becomes sort of automatic after you've been flying for a while.
Same as driving a car.
Pretty much, yep. And
is there more to contend with than driving a car?
There is, because if something goes wrong, you've got to keep flying the plane. You can't just pull over and call up the RAA.
Glide down, it's just...
You do glide down. You've got no choice.
Yes.
Where you come to a stop is basically in your hands, and that's the thing you've got to face.
Is that because of the planes that you're flying? They're light aircraft.
They're all light aircraft, but it doesn't matter. I mean, even if you were flying a 747 and had complete engine failure, you would still glide the plane.
Yes. Well, you can't land on a hillside, really, can you? You need
well,
a bit of a
you
flex.
may have no choice.
Oh, well, that's true, but only in the movies do they manage to find in the middle of a mountain range that little bit of an airstrip.
Yeah, indeed. So I'd rather have a crash in my little plane, which is landing at about 40 kilometres an hour, than I would in a 747 that's landing at 300 kilometres an hour.
Particularly if you had a whole group of people sitting behind you, depending on you.
Indeed.
Not to change the subject too much, but people who are suffering, as your wife did, and in many ways as your son has, how did they cope? How did they cope with knowing that, well, I guess their life was limited and their ability to communicate was limited?
Look, some people cope better than others, and I have to say that Eve didn't particularly cope well. Her relief, I guess, was drinking alcohol, which didn't help her mental state, unfortunately. My son is similar. He doesn't mind the odd beer or two to sort of calm things down a bit.
Is that to knock out the inevitable loss, do you think, or can they explain why? Yeah, look,
they haven't explained that to me. But then again, there are other friends of ours who also had the same disease, who went on to be really positive and look at a very positive way of dealing with this, and be very proactive in terms of setting up self-help groups or setting up organisations that help promote and fight the disease, or do as best you possibly could, even though physically it was affecting you, and they wouldn't let it get on top of them and fought it.
Did your wife have a profession that she wasn't able to continue with?
She worked as an accounts clerk, I think, prior to... so we had 3 kids. So after my daughter was born, she was the second child. From that time on, she was basically a housewife, stayed at home looking after the kids.
But even that would have come with difficulties, I'm sure.
Well, initially, she wasn't diagnosed until a year after my youngest son was born.
Okay.
So that's when things started sort of going a bit pear-shaped. Again, mostly her mental health, when she realised what was in store for her down the track, and we had no idea when it was going to happen, of course, but that cost her, I think, in terms of her mental health.
The signing thing I just find extraordinary, and I've sort of, because we've talked a bit before I've chatted to you with this program, but it's been fascinating to me because using parts of your body to communicate other than our voice, actors use it all the time because the body language that you need to, to be able to portray the characters with, we actually use body language so much more than we realise.
Indeed.
How much body language goes into signing?
A lot. People think that signing is just the use of the hands. It's not. It's to do with facial expression, it's to do with body posture and language, and so all of those things combined are called sign language. So it's very important.
With all of the different, versions of the language, like you were saying about the American being different, I just wonder how much of that, and I could be quite wrong with this assumption, but I remember watching all those old movies where the Native Americans use sign language for certain things.
Yep.
Has that morphed into a modern language, or has that remained with them? Do you know?
I think they would have kept that as well. I think some of our Aboriginal tribes have also had a sign language of their own.
Right.
I'm not
for
sure
the reason of deafness, or just
I'm not sure.
Intimate communication.
Yeah, I'm just not sure whether that was as a result of deafness or whether they just use that to be quiet and sign. I know we use some field signals in the army, where again you didn't want to be heard, so we would sign things to other soldiers.
This is around the corner and don't.
Yeah, so that sort of thing. So there were specific signs that we used there. I know the US Navy SEALs, they actually use sign language because they do a lot of their work underwater.
Right. Oh, yes.
And so they do that
too. There.
Yeah.
A bit hard to have a chat underwater when you've got the face mask on. Although, mind you, with technology, you can work out with a little microphone.
Yeah, they might have that in place, but no, I'm pretty sure they have signing as well.
Just absolutely fascinating, Stan, and congratulations on what you've achieved with all of this.
Thank you.
But we'll be back in a tick because there's a nice end to Stan's story. Stan Nowakowski has been a special guest in this episode. Stan, it's been great hearing about signing and just to get a better understanding of it, because we were just so used to this happening beside people talking, and I've never really had an opportunity to understand it completely.
Yep.
The good news for you is after your wife passed, you actually met somebody else.
I did indeed. So one of the people that used to look after Cheryl, one of her support workers was look after Eve, was a lady named Cheryl, whom I caught up with after Eve passed away. I can't remember her during the time that Eve was still alive because...
Your concentration was on Eve.
Yeah, that's right. I was looking after her and there were many people coming in and out of the house and what have you. But she did a follow-up visit some three or 4 months after Eve passed away, just to check up on me, how I was travelling. And so we had a coffee and then it sort of went on from there.
But she signs too, doesn't she?
So Cheryl's hard of hearing. Without her hearing aid, she's fully deaf. And she's been brought up in the deaf community. She and I both went to TAFE some years later and both qualified as interpreters. So I'm a qualified Auslan interpreter. Cheryl is a qualified deaf interpreter. Now the difference is that a deaf interpreter is normally utilised with a hearing interpreter. So for example, if you were interviewing someone or speaking to someone, I would convert what you're saying from English to Auslan, I would relay that to Cheryl, and Cheryl would break that down into a non-conventional sign language.
Right.
For someone who is either from a country where they don't speak Auslan, where they don't sign Auslan, they may have an intellectual disability, or their Auslan skills are very poor.
I understand. Dan, it's been great talking with you. It's time for us to go. Can you sign a goodbye, as I say it? Not like that. Thank you very much for being part of our time this time. Stan has been fantastic at explaining what he's explained. I hope that's helped you, and I hope in the future we appreciate people that sign a whole lot more. So until next time on Our Time, thank you, Stan. Goodbye. Keep yourself nice. Till next time.